When people imagine the Mongols, they picture thundering hooves, curved bows, and blades flashing beneath storm-dark skies. Yet medieval chroniclers often began their accounts not with weapons, but with fear. Long before cities were besieged or armies clashed, stories of devastation moved across trade routes and royal courts. Rumors described riders appearing without warning, fortresses collapsing in days, and rulers vanishing into exile. By the time Mongol banners were seen on the horizon, many defenders were already uncertain. The greatest advantage the Mongols possessed was not forged in iron. It was forged in perception. In 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan on the Mongolian steppe, he did not command ancient capitals or vast treasuries. He commanded disciplined horsemen and a vision. What followed was not merely a campaign of conquest, but a transformation in how war was understood. The Mongols mastered something few empires had fully grasped, the ability to shape how their enemies thought. Their secret weapon was invisible, yet devastating. It traveled faster than cavalry, crossed borders without resistance, and weakened walls from the inside. Before the first arrow was loosed, doubt had already begun its work. In 1206, on the open plains of Mongolia, Temujin gathered the rival tribes of the steppe and was proclaimed Genghis Khan. Often translated as universal ruler. The title marked the beginning of something far more significant than personal supremacy. It signaled the construction of a system designed for control, coordination, and expansion. For generations, steppe society had been fractured by clan loyalties and blood feuds. Authority depended on kinship and shifting alliances. Genghis Khan dismantled that unstable order and replaced it with a disciplined military structure that would become the foundation of Mongol dominance. He reorganized his followers into a decimal hierarchy, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These divisions were not symbolic, they were deliberate instruments of cohesion. Warriors from different tribes were mixed within the same units, breaking traditional loyalties and redirecting allegiance toward central command. A man's identity was no longer defined solely by clan, but by his place within a structured chain of command. Promotion depended on merit, loyalty, and proven ability in battle rather than noble birth. Capable individuals could rise quickly, creating a culture that rewarded performance over lineage. Discipline was enforced through collective responsibility. If one soldier deserted or disobeyed orders, his entire unit could face punishment. This principle ensured mutual accountability and fostered extraordinary cohesion under pressure. Commands were expected to be executed immediately and without hesitation. In an army built for mobility, delay could mean disaster. The result was a force that moved with unified intent rather than fragmented impulse. Communication strengthened this framework further. Mounted couriers relayed messages across vast distances, while flags, horns, and drums transmitted signals during battle. Units separated by miles of open terrain could coordinate complex maneuvers as if they were a single organism. What enemies perceived as chaotic swarms of riders were, in reality, synchronized detachments operating under precise direction. The harsh environment of the steppe had already produced expert horsemen capable of riding for days and firing accurately at full gallop. When that natural mobility fused with rigid organization, it created a military machine unlike any in Eurasia. This structure was not merely a tool for conquest. It was the mechanism that allowed the Mongols' invisible weapon, intelligence, coordination, and psychological dominance, to function with terrifying efficiency. Discipline and structure gave the Mongols strength, but information gave them precision. Before their armies crossed borders, scouts had already studied the terrain. Riders moved quietly ahead of the main force, mapping rivers, measuring distances between settlements, identifying mountain passes, and noting which cities were fortified and which were vulnerable. Intelligence was not an afterthought, it was the first stage of every campaign. The Mongols sought to understand their enemies before confronting them. Merchants and envoys often played a role in this process. Trade caravans moved freely across Eurasia, and with them traveled knowledge of political rivalries, economic weaknesses, and internal tensions. When diplomatic missions were sent, they did more than deliver messages. They observed roads, city layouts, garrison strengths, and the temperament of rulers. Even hostile encounters provided insight. The execution of Mongol envoys at Otrar in 1218, for example, revealed not only defiance but also the fragmentation and overconfidence within the Khwarezmian Empire. By the time Genghis Khan launched his invasion of Khwarezm in 1219, the campaign was not a reckless surge of vengeance. It was a calculated operation informed by prior reconnaissance. Rather than advancing as a single mass, Mongol forces divided into multiple columns, striking from unexpected directions across deserts and mountain passes. This approach confused defenders who expected a conventional invasion. Cities prepared for assaults from one direction found enemies appearing from another. The psychological effect was immediate. Leaders struggled to coordinate responses against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Intelligence also shaped battlefield tactics. Mongol commanders studied the habits of opposing armies, learning how heavily armored cavalry preferred decisive charges and how feudal forces often lacked unified command. Knowing this, they crafted strategies that exploited pride and momentum. The famous feigned retreat was not improvisation, it was informed by understanding how enemies were likely to react. This emphasis on knowledge reduced uncertainty and amplified confidence within Mongol ranks. Soldiers trusted that their leaders had chosen ground carefully and anticipated enemy movements. Meanwhile, opponents faced confusion and doubt. The Mongols' secret weapon was not simply fear. It was the calculated gathering and use of information, turning awareness into advantage long before swords crossed or arrows flew. Information allowed the Mongols to strike with precision, but it was reputation that allowed them to strike with efficiency. As their campaigns expanded beyond the steppe, they developed a pattern that transformed fear into a force multiplier. The principle was stark and consistent: surrender brought survival, resistance brought devastation. This was not chaos or uncontrolled brutality. It was a calculated system designed to send a message that would travel farther than any army. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221, this pattern became unmistakable. When cities such as Bokhara and later Samarkand resisted, Mongol forces responded with overwhelming force. Siege engineers breached walls methodically, defenders were defeated publicly, and the consequences were visible enough to ensure that neighboring regions took notice. Yet in other places where surrender came quickly, destruction was limited. Skilled artisans, administrators, and engineers were often spared and incorporated into the growing empire. The contrast was deliberate. It demonstrated that submission could preserve life and stability, while defiance invited ruin. Survivors from devastated cities sometimes fled along trade routes, carrying accounts of what they had witnessed. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the cumulative effect. Along the Silk Road, merchants repeated stories of annihilated garrisons and shattered fortresses. These accounts reached courts and council chambers long before Mongol cavalry did. Governors debated whether resistance was worth the risk. Many chose to open their gates rather than test the pattern themselves. This strategy reduced the need for prolonged sieges and costly assaults. Fear conserved manpower. Instead of fighting every city block by block, Mongol commanders could rely on reputation to weaken resolve before battle began. When gates opened without resistance, it was not merely a diplomatic success, it was proof that perception had done its work. The secret weapon was not only terror, but predictability. By enforcing a clear and consistent response to resistance, the Mongols made their threats credible. Over time, the expectation of devastation became as powerful as devastation itself. Cities fell not only because walls were breached, but because doubt had already breached them from within. If reputation weakened cities before sieges began, deception shattered armies once battle was joined. Among the Mongols' most effective battlefield techniques was the feigned retreat, a maneuver that exploited the expectations of their enemies. At first glance, it appeared simple. Mongol cavalry would advance, loose arrows to test formations, and then suddenly turn and withdraw. To commanders trained in traditions of decisive engagement, retreat signaled weakness. Victory seemed within reach. The instinct to pursue was powerful, especially for heavily armored cavalry accustomed to breaking enemy lines through shock. But the retreat was rarely genuine. Mongol riders maintained disciplined spacing even as they withdrew, continuing to fire backward with remarkable accuracy. Their composite bows allowed them to strike while moving at full speed, harassing pursuers and stretching formations thinner with every moment. As enemy forces surged forward in fragmented pursuit, communication broke down. Units outran their infantry support. Commanders lost control amid dust and confusion. What had been a cohesive line became scattered groups of isolated fighters. The Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223 revealed how devastating this tactic could be. Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe faced a coalition of Rus princes and their Kuman allies. After initial engagements, the Mongols withdrew deliberately, drawing the coalition into a prolonged chase that lasted several days. Convinced they were pursuing a defeated enemy, the Rus forces pressed forward across unfamiliar terrain. Fatigue set in. Coordination weakened. When the Mongols finally turned to confront them, they did so on ground of their choosing. Hidden reserves struck from the flanks, completing an encirclement that trapped the exhausted coalition. Leaders were targeted first, accelerating panic. The alliance collapsed into disorganized resistance and was destroyed. Such maneuvers demanded extraordinary discipline. A retreat could easily become genuine if morale faltered, yet Mongol units trusted their structure and timing. Their enemies, driven by pride and momentum, often contributed to their own defeat. The battlefield became a psychological arena as much as a physical one. The Mongols understood that perception shaped reaction. By manipulating the expectation that retreat meant weakness, they transformed confidence into vulnerability and ensured that confusion spread faster than their arrows. By 1241, the Mongol advance had reached the frontiers of Europe, and the invisible weapon that had undone Central Asia was about to test the confidence of Western Christendom. For years, reports of shattered principalities and annihilated armies had traveled westward, but distance softened their urgency. Many rulers believed the devastation exaggerated, a problem for distant lands beyond their concern. That illusion collapsed in April. On April 9, 1241, near Legnica in Poland, a coalition of European forces, Silesian Knights, troops from the Teutonic Order, and regional levies, assembled to confront the Mongol army led by Bata Khan and the veteran general Subutai. Armored cavalry stood ready, confident in the traditions of shock warfare that had defined European battle for generations. The Mongols did not meet them on familiar terms. Initial exchanges of arrows were followed by what appeared to be withdrawal. As at Khalkha, pursuit followed swiftly. Knights charged forward, formations stretching as speed overtook coordination. Smoke drifted across the field, obscuring visibility and amplifying confusion. At a calculated moment, Mongol units pivoted and struck. Arrows targeted leaders, breaking command structure. Units that had surged ahead found themselves isolated. The coalition unraveled not from lack of courage, but from loss of cohesion. Just 2 days later, on April 11, a far larger confrontation unfolded at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary. King Bela IV positioned his forces near the Sejo River, believing the natural barrier and fortified camp would restrict Mongol movement. The Mongols launched a frontal assault at the bridge, fixing Hungarian attention. Under cover of darkness, another force constructed a crossing downstream. When battle resumed, Hungarian troops faced attack from multiple directions. Feigned retreats lured segments into exposed terrain while encirclement tightened around the camp. Heavy armor, once a symbol of strength, became a burden in mud and chaos. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Survivors carried news of sudden reversals and disciplined maneuvering to courts across Europe. Confidence faltered. Fortifications and tradition no longer guaranteed safety. The Mongols had demonstrated that mobility, deception, and coordinated intelligence could dismantle even the most prestigious armies. Europe confronted not just a military threat, but a transformation in how war itself could be waged. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had extended deep into the Middle East, and its reputation had already become a force in its own right. Yet the campaign that culminated in 1258 would demonstrate how symbolism could magnify that reputation beyond the battlefield. Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, advanced toward Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. For centuries, Baghdad had stood as a political and intellectual center of the Islamic world, a city whose prestige seemed inseparable from its survival. Many believed its history alone offered protection. The Mongols saw only a strategic objective. Hulagu's approach followed the established pattern. Mongol forces encircled the city, cutting off supply routes and preventing escape. Siege engines, refined through decades of adaptation and often operated by engineers drawn from earlier campaigns in China and Persia, were positioned methodically. Artillery battered the walls while cavalry sealed the perimeter. The assault was disciplined and deliberate rather than chaotic. Within weeks, the defenses failed. The fall of Baghdad carried consequences far beyond military defeat. Contemporary chroniclers describe immense destruction and loss of life, though details vary in scale. What remains clear is the psychological shock. The Abbasid Caliph, once regarded as a symbol of enduring authority, proved unable to defend his capital. Libraries and institutions associated with centuries of scholarship were devastated, reinforcing the sense that a historic order had collapsed. Whether every account was precise mattered less than how the event was perceived across the region. The message was unmistakable. If Baghdad could fall, no city could rely solely on prestige, faith, or history for protection. The pattern of submission or destruction that had defined earlier campaigns was now reinforced at the highest symbolic level. Rulers across the Middle East absorbed the lesson quickly. Resistance risked annihilation, submission offered survival within the Mongol system. Baghdad marked the apex of the Mongols' invisible weapon. It was not merely a victory of siegecraft, but a demonstration that psychological dominance could reshape entire civilizations. Fear no longer traveled as rumor alone, it carried the weight of a fallen capital. In the end, the Mongols proved that their most powerful weapon was not forged from iron, but from understanding. Structure gave them discipline, intelligence gave them precision, deception gave them advantage, and fear gave them reach. Their armies moved swiftly across continents, but their reputation often arrived first. Cities surrendered because doubt had already taken hold. Armies collapsed because expectation had been manipulated. The sword and bow delivered the final blow, but the battle was often decided before they were drawn. Yet an invisible weapon demands constant reinforcement. Fear must be sustained through momentum and unity. After the deaths of great Khans and the fragmentation of the empire into competing khanates, that aura of inevitability began to weaken. Expansion slowed. Rivals adapted. The Mongols remained formidable, but the unstoppable surge diminished. What endured was the lesson. They had demonstrated that wars can be shaped as much by perception as by steel. The sharpest weapon in their arsenal was the ability to control how enemies thought, reacted, and chose. In mastering that, they changed the rules of warfare long after the dust of their campaigns had settled.